Do you think cash for clunkers is impacting your end of the business today? Um, because I see it all the time in comments. It's cash for clunkers. It screwed everything up. Last time I checked, that was like 14 years ago, um, 15 years ago, 13 years ago. I don't see how it would impact it today because the cars that I know that the clunkers we took in at the dealership I worked at, most of them were worthless. Most of them were literally really absolute clunkers that you wouldn't want on the road. And even if they had some life left in them, they certainly didn't have 12 or 13 or 14 years worth of life left in them that you'd still be able to get your hands on them today.
Yeah, I'm looking up the. Do you remember the year that actually happened?
I want to say, was it 2010, 2011?
Yeah, that's when I was guessing. So it was right before I actually got into it, and so the cars that really that it affected, because you think about if it was in 2010, it's going to be cars that weren't worth anything. So in 2010, what cars really weren't worth hardly anything? It's going to be the early 90s to mid 90s cars, the ones that at least that were on the road. I mean, you're going to have some 80s cars, but a lot
Yeah.
of those cars didn't last very long anyway.
Yeah.
But the 90s cars, you started to see cars that could put on 150, 200,000, 250,000 miles. And those were the cars that are affected. So that didn't really hit me because when I came onto the scene as far as buying and selling cars, the oldest cars that I would buy a lot of would be later 90s cars. And that was
Mhm.
right after the era that this would affect. Now, my grandfather, he was in the business for 50 plus years. And the old timers that I would talk to a lot, they talked about cash for clunkers a lot.
Yeah.
And it hits a lot of their cars because my grandfather was also a car dealer that sold. Now, he didn't sell stuff in the range of me, but he was in the next tier up.
Yeah.
He did mid tier, he did trucks, things like that. But it ended up hitting some of his lower level cars that he would buy every once in a while. And he's like, all those cars just kind of disappeared for a couple of years. And it was cars that you could buy at auction then for like $200, $300, and then they would flip them around for $1,200, $1,300,
Mhm.
$1,500, whatever. And a lot of buy here, pay here dealers did that kind of thing because they could get the money down that they actually spent on the car. So it
Exactly.
hurt the buy here, pay here space a lot more than it did a lot of these mid tier dealers. But I've always heard throughout from these older dealers how much it hit those dealers, the cash for clunkers. But really, for me, it didn't really affect anything because you got to think about the eras of cars. So the early 90s cars are going to be the ones that were really taken out of circulation. If you think about the 15 to 20-year-old cars from when that actually came into effect.
Yeah, they
So I
wouldn't.
never saw. Go ahead.
I was going to say they wouldn't still be around today, even if there hadn't been cash for clunkers, because they didn't. These vehicles didn't have another 10 or 12 or 15 years worth of life left in them at the time that they were. They just. I don't see how it would impact used vehicles today, or the availability of used vehicles today, because those vehicles would be so old today that they would have no value. They would have no life left to them.
And you got to think about the kind of cars that people would just want to throw away anyway that weren't worth anything. They weren't going to last. So, like a lot of these old Nissan, old domestic cars that they weren't going to last 150,000 miles anyway. But the ones you still see on the roads now from the mid 90s are like Toyota Camrys. Like they would run forever, but
Yeah,
people weren't trying to throw those cars away. Like they would still bring some money so they could sell them on the free market for more than what the dealership was going to scrap them for through the government. So I mean, the answer is going to be yes and no. It really affected a market for the short amount of time where it was active, where it took a lot of those cars out of circulation. But those, in my opinion, there was really no long term effects on the market.
I tend to agree with you, and I will say this: I can't even count it would take more than the fingers of two hands to count the number of clunkers that actually had to be towed into the dealership for us to take them in trade. They were that bad. Okay. Um, this was the cream of the crap. This was the ultimate crap in used cars, at least at the dealerships that I worked at that time, and we were a Nissan and Acura dealer. Um, I mean, most of them were such POSs that you were glad to get them off the road. Most of them weren't on the road anyway. They were just sitting in people's yards or wherever and literally had to be towed into the dealership so that the people could take advantage of the cash for clunkers.
So just in case you weren't sure if your technology is listening to you, I just typed into Google "what," and it filled out what is cash for clunkers. So let's just pull this up, but just to give you that little scare real quick, because it is absolutely listening to me and knowing exactly what I'm talking about and what I'm about to search for. But cash for clunkers, also known as car allowance rebate system, CARS, was a U.S. government program that offered financial incentives to trade in old, less fuel efficient vehicles for newer, more fuel efficient ones. So the amount of money that they would get, it would pay the dealers between $3,500 and $4,500 each. And these cars that these people were trading in, they were $300, $400, $500 cars, maybe.
Exactly.
Yeah, especially if they were getting them towed in and they were getting
Yes.
$3,500 for this $50 scrap pile.
Yes. Yeah, I mean there was an advantage for those people who had those vehicles. It was a gift, okay, and it was a gift to the industry in the sense that sales were so stagnant at that time. It was so hard to sell cars, to get banks to finance cars, to get people approved for the loans. It was
You just use that as a down payment, right?
exactly. So
Yeah.
it was a very, very difficult time. And it was a way to give a boost to, people think, well, you're giving a boost to the industry. You were giving a boost to local dealerships. You were helping the local economy. Okay. It yeah, it had a national effect, but it was really localized as to getting these local people to come to local dealerships to trade in their pieces of crap so that they could get $3,500 to $4,500 from the government for them. So it was a way to help stimulate the local economy. It was a way to stimulate the automobile industry as a whole. And it was a lifeline that worked. It was one of the few things that actually worked to bring people back into the market so we could start selling cars again. It was pretty significant.
Yeah, I wish they would bring it back. I'll just unload my whole car lot on my on the government. I think we would make money. So I just looked at our numbers last night. We have 91 cars, and we have right at $200,000 in all of those cars. So we would absolutely make money on that program.
Yes, yes, you would. You could double your money.
Yeah, especially if they give us the top range. That we wouldn't even do a dock fee to the government. We would. I wonder if even if they want to negotiate 10% off. I'll take 10% off. All right, that's the new program. We need to send a letter into Trump for his first.
I'm trying to remember. Was it initially $1 billion that they had set aside for it, and I believe.
They probably blew that out of the water.
We blew through, as an industry, we blew through that in like the first 4 or 5 days, and then I think they added a second billion, because it worked. It literally worked. It brought people back into the market and helped to stimulate the economy both nationally and especially locally.
So was the car market so bad at that time that, okay, even all this influx of sales, did it make prices go up, or was it just so weak at the time in 2010? I mean, it's the weakest time ever for the car market,
Yeah,
right?
it was terrible. Yeah.
All right. Well, a lot of you might not realize this, but this is a brand new channel. So make sure you hit that subscribe button, like, and let us know what you want us to talk about.
It was,
Yeah.
I mean, it was, the business was a struggle. And not that anybody ever feels sorry or bad for car dealers, but it was, it was an absolute struggle to find qualified customers, be able to get them financed, because all the banks, what brought on the Great Recession? Well, they were giving mortgages to people who could fog a mirror but had no other means to actually get that mortgage. So banks were forced to tighten their lending guidelines, and they were extremely tight. And if you weren't top tier, it was virtually impossible to get financing for people. It was just an absolute struggle, that I wouldn't wish on anybody. But let's face it, the Great Recession wasn't a fun thing to live through. When the Great Recession hit, I was in Arizona, and I worked at a pretty successful Acura dealership, and our average new car sales a month were 100 new Acuras. When I was asked to leave, that number was down to 52. Within 3 months of me leaving, that number of sales was down to about 15.
Wow.
Okay. So there was an 85% drop in sales in the Phoenix market for Acura. I eventually moved to a dealership in Maryland. And they were struggling because it was only like a 50 to 60% decline in sales. Well, that was significantly better than what we were seeing in Phoenix, but it was still awful. I mean, just awful. Imagine you're at your job, and the business you work for gets cut in half today. What happens then? And how do you find that money so that you can continue? And it was a real incredible struggle. It was as close to living through Depression era conditions as I can think of. Luckily I didn't live through the Depression, but my God, the Great Recession was scary as can be.
So as bad as we talk about how the car market is now, we're nowhere close to what it was 2008, 2009, 2010.
No.
Because I would imagine like a program like Cash for Clunkers, if you threw that into the system right now for us, it would make the prices moon again.
Yeah. Yes, they would go up. And it wasn't designed to get prices to go. It was just designed to get some people in the market. That's all it was designed for. Just bring some people in the market, and it worked. I'm telling you, it gave those of us in retail automotive at the time, it gave us a sense that we could survive. Because the sense prior to that was not sure how we're going to. It was a real slog. That's all I can say.
Yeah, I'm glad I got into the business afterwards, because if I would have got into it right in the middle of it, I probably would not be selling cars right now.
Yeah, you probably would have gotten out of it.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to change topics.
Okay.
All right, Ray. So we're seeing that inventory is continuing. It
is. Hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. Tell every living person you know that they need to subscribe to Car Sense with Brandon and Ray.